That was the bell. No, I'm okay today. Thank you, Lydia. We are in First Corinthians chapter 11 this morning, and we just barely began to get into this last week because we had to wrap up chapter 10 first, and there was no way to finish all of 11. Of course, we're not trying to finish 11 today anyway, but this first section down through verse number 16, because this text is one of the most difficult, maybe the most difficult in this letter to interpret. It's difficult in itself, and that difficulty is amplified in that there are some who argue it contradicts another text we find just a few chapters later, in chapter 14, where we have a restriction that's placed on women speaking in the assembly. I'm not going to get too much into that today. If we were looking at this, more topically, I'd actually probably look at that passage first and then come back to this one. But we're trying to take the letter here in order as it stands, so I'm alluding to it here. If you remember, towards the end of chapter 14, Paul says in verse 33, "As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church." And we'll come back to that in a few weeks when we get to it and probably reiterate some of the things we're saying about this text to try to compare them here. But the upshot is there we see a clear restriction placed on women speaking in the assembly. And yet here we see women praying and prophesying in chapter 11, and Paul says nothing to forbid it. So is this a direct contradiction of what he says later? Some think so. If you were here last week, I mentioned some of these just as we were kind of ending up the class. But just to give you an idea, from the Tyndale commentaries, Leon Morris says this verse plainly indicates that some Corinthian women prayed or prophesied in public worship, that Paul does not criticize the practice, but on the contrary, lays down the way women should be dressed when engaging in it, shows that he accepted it, which raises a problem with 14:34 and 35. That's not an unusual view. Others, if you go look in other commentaries, you'll find, not all of them, but some of them say that same thing. Well, Paul seems to accept praying and prophesying by women in the assembly here, so how do we reconcile that with chapter 14? I don't think that's actually the case here. We'll get to that in a moment. But even beyond that, as I've already mentioned, this passage is difficult to deal with in itself because the situation here is obscure. To give one more example, and I also read this last week, but this is from Carl Holliday in the Living Word commentary. He says, "The meaning of these verses appears to be hopelessly unclear, in spite of many ingenious but ill-fated attempts to explain them. The most one can hope for are a few shafts which might illuminate a few dark corners, but even then the room as a whole is still dimly lit. The commentator's task is to keep the obscure from becoming even more obscure." I think there's a lot of wisdom in what he says, and that we always have to be careful in trying to reconstruct things and not put too much weight on our reconstruction. And we always have to be cautious and admit that there's some things that we just can't say for certain because we're only privy to one side of the conversation here. We don't know exactly the situation Paul's addressing here. But there are some things we can say for sure about this passage. We'll talk about those when we look at Paul's reasoning. But I also think we can say some things, even if we don't know exactly what's going on, we can say some things about the historical circumstances here based not only on what we know about Greco-Roman society, Corinthian culture in particular, but also I think we can say something of the problem that's at work here just based on what we know about the church in Corinth, based on other clues that we pick up throughout this letter, because this seems to be something of those same old problems of divisions and factionalism and different social and class distinctions that are at work here. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. I want to just begin here by attempting the best reconstruction we can of what's going on. We started to get into this last week, but I'll read the passage again. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That's why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority over her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So the one thing we really addressed last week, we asked the question, what's the basic issue that Paul is addressing? We got some good feedback on that, and some of you, I think, were really getting at a lot of the point that he's making here. But just in terms of the actual circumstance, the actual situation here, this is about head coverings. That's really what he's talking about fundamentally. Now he's going to make some points from that and why they're important or not important, or why this is even an issue. But we need to keep in mind here, first of all, women praying and prophesying is not the focus of this passage. That's not what this is about. It's incidental. That's not the main point here. And secondly, this is not a discussion of veiling of women, because sometimes this is also read, and you might be familiar, somebody talked to me about it last week, but you might know of churches like this, you might even have visited them in the past, where women, even today, wear veils based on this passage. Well, this passage is not about the veiling of women exclusively. If you notice, women and men are addressed here in terms of what's culturally respectable and appropriate attire, based on their mutual and reciprocal respect for one another, the respect that they're to have for God. In fact, when Paul first talks about veiling there in verse number 4, he talks about men before he talks about women. Every man who prays or dishonors with his head covered dishonors his head. He returns 3 verses later to that same subject. Verse 7, a man ought not to cover his head. So we need to remember that. He's talking about men covering their head here too, not just women. We'll come back to that in a moment. Another thing that we need to keep in mind, I've sort of touched on this already, is the problem of factionalism and jealousy and worldly distinctions that existed in the church in Corinth. How many times have we seen that come up again and again in this letter? We know factionalism is their main underlying problem. That's what Paul begins the letter addressing. I've heard reports that there's divisions among you. And that seems to manifest itself in a number of different ways. We see people going to taking each other to court, suing one another. We see those talking about how they have knowledge and thinking that they're somehow superior to others. We have this sense of those who are the haves and the have-nots. So keep that big theme in mind, because I think we're seeing another manifestation of that here. But I'll say this in verse 3, read here, I want you to understand the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, the head of Christ is God. Some of you touched on this just as we began last week, at least in principle. That word translated head here in Greek, that could either mean ruler or authority figure, something like that. You might think of the head of a company, the head of a nation. We use the word that way even in English. It could also mean source or origin, like the head of a stream. We use it that way in English as well. So, which understanding here do you think best fits what Paul's talking about? Because there is some discussion about this too. What do you think Paul means when he said by head here? The head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, the head of Christ is God. Is he talking in terms of authority or in terms of source or origin? We have a disagreement right there. That's interesting. Right from the same pew here, Lydia says authority and Jerry says source. Why do you all think that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's source? Yeah, certainly when you're talking about God being the source there, nothing you're saying is wrong. I do think in context here, though, it's focused more on as leader or authority figure. He uses head here as a sort of metaphor for that guiding principle here. And when you read down through there and you notice how he does talk about creation, so there is that sense of source there. But he talks about even as a symbol of authority down in verse number 10. I think in context, that's more what this is about. But we need to remember, this indicates, even when we're talking authority, this indicates a relationship not of domination, but of submission, and in fact, mutual submission. He makes that clear here with the discussion of mutuality of the woman and the man, that they both have these responsibilities. And I want to make that clear. That is something that comes up again and again in the New Testament. You could compare Jesus' submission. When he talks here about the head of Christ is God, well, Christ, Jesus in the flesh, he submitted to the Father as the God-man. You could think about him praying there in the garden, for instance. So the whole point of this is that submission is a fundamentally Christian way of being. How often do we see Paul talk about that in other contexts? Not only in terms of man and wife relationships, but you could think about it in terms of voluntarily submitting to governing authorities. You could think of it in terms of relationships between employees and employers, on and on. We see this in Scripture. That principle would have seemed obvious to his audience, this idea of authority and submission, but it sets the framework for everything that he's talking about here. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the literary situation, we need to think of the context in the letter too. Remember, the Corinthians wrote Paul a letter. That's where we are really beginning in chapter 7, verse 1. You remember he says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. And then he starts to address them just, seriatim, one thing after another. And so we often see that, now concerning this, and he changes the subject to something else they've written them about. Now, no, he doesn't say now concerning here. But there is a shift in topic. And so we can imagine, I commend you, he says, verse 2, because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. So what we can imagine, based on the fact that we know he's addressing this letter here in this second half of the letter, we can imagine that they'd probably written something to him here about observing the traditions Paul had handed them. They've written something positively about that, and Paul commends them. Hey, you do that, and that's a good thing. And one of these traditions, evidently, is women wearing a head covering in public and men not doing that. But in this tradition, some of the Corinthians are wondering, well, why? Why do we need to do that? Maybe some of them, who knows, this is speculating here, but maybe some of them are pressing for full equality now. You know, we're all one in Christ, right? So why do we need to maintain these distinctions? I'll come back to that in a moment. For a woman, even a married woman, though she'd wear a veil out in public, you wouldn't normally wear one in your own home. And if other people were coming in to meet together in the home, which they did because there's no church buildings, well, why should I put one on then? So that's probably some of the situation here, and in response, Paul's going to offer some reasons why in their cultural setting he makes some of these distinctions between male and female appearance in the head covering. Yes, sir, Wayne. I think that's an extremely perceptive point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, Paul's going to lay out some principles for why this is a big deal in that time, and those principles are still applicable to us, I would say. But what Wayne just said here is right on. I'm going to come back to this in a moment when we look at his reasoning. But Wayne said the way that he talks about this is based on tradition. It's based on the cultural standards of that day and age. And so those particular acts, those particular manifestations of this might not be applicable to us anymore. And I think that's absolutely right, and that's pretty clear when you see the way Paul talks about this. Incidentally, I want to make that point really strongly because I want you to keep that in mind. Keep it in sort of the back of your head there for a few weeks from now. When we get to chapter 14, we'll see that Paul makes his point there in a different way. He's not arguing based on cultural, traditional manifestations of this. He bases it on some timeless principles there. But that's a great point. Thing to keep in mind for now. The subject here is the head covering and the justification for that, not other matters. So we need to keep the main thing here. So, yes, Glenda. I think that's the big principle here. Yeah, I think that is part of the big principle, and there shouldn't be any confusion of those different roles. You're right. To Wayne's point, the way that manifests itself might be cultural. You know, you could think about, we'll get to this later, but just off the top of my head, the long hair and short hair, that's something that is a relative thing, right? But even, you think even into like the late 60s and the 70s when guys started growing their hair long, well, it was still relatively shorter than women, right? You still notice that difference. And so some of those things, they can change in some sense, but there still needs to be a distinction there. I want to talk about the historical circumstances here because I think this helps us to understand it a little better. It's something that's not necessarily obvious to us, but we have this tendency to just rush right past this part about men covering their heads, and we need to understand what that's all about. a lot of scholars, and this is strange to me. If you read some commentaries, you'll see them just dismiss this as a sort of hypothetical. Paul's talking about men wearing a head covering for the sake of argument, but the real point is women wearing one. The real issue is women who are uncovered. Paul's just arguing rhetorically here. I think this is actually part of the circumstance that's being addressed here, though, and knowing something about Corinthian society, knowing something about Roman religious practices helps us understand this. The translation, the ESV here just says covered or uncovered, which is probably pretty good. You may have a translation that says veil. And I think that translation of veil is maybe not the best one in modern day English, because I think we have this tendency, especially with when we think of veils today, we typically associate them with the Muslim world. And so we think of some covering where only the eyes are showing, something like that, a total veilment here. But head covering is better, because what we're really talking about here is something more like a shawl or even a toga that's been pulled up over the top of the head. So we're not talking about covering your whole face here. We're talking about something just covering the top of your head. There is ample evidence that we know of, historically, archaeologically, of Roman men drawing their togas over their heads when they prayed publicly or when they offered pagan sacrifices. And in fact, we found evidence of this, depictions of it, in Corinth. So, if you're taking a leading part in pagan worship, if you're the one offering the sacrifice, if you're the one praying there at the temple, as a man, you would do this. Now, who, in terms of power or in terms of class, who's going to be the one who's offering a sacrifice or offering a prayer at the temple? Who's in that privileged position? Yeah, priest or otherwise some other elite members of society. But priest in the Roman world a lot of times was sort of a political position. So, in other words, it's the movers and shakers. It's the elites who were doing this, drawing their togas up over their heads when they're praying or when they're sacrificing. So it seems likely that this practice is continuing, at least by some there in the church, that some men in the Corinthian church were pulling their togas up over their heads when they were praying, when they were prophesying, just like pagan priests would. Possibly, this was even those who were the elites within the church. Remember, there's a handful of those. We've seen them before. Another way to mark themselves out as sort of superior to everybody else. We don't know that for a fact, but that's at least consistent with the sort of behavior we've seen in Corinth, isn't it? That they're real big on drawing these distinctions, on judging themselves according to the standards of the world. It makes sense in context, and at the least, they're drawing the toga up over their head. That's what he's referencing here with them doing it with their heads covered. Secondly, then, we have to note the behavior of wives. A hood, that covering, or a veil, was what a married woman was expected to wear in public as a mark of respectability. And so this is a clue that Paul is talking here specifically about wives, for one thing. He's not talking about women in general here in this passage. You could add to that the fact that back in verse number 3, he talks about the head of a wife is her husband. In Roman society, women traditionally had very few rights compared to their husbands. But in the 1st century BC and then in the 1st century AD, there was a reaction to this. You could think of it as sort of an ancient women's lib movement or feminist movement. A number of women, particularly elite women, women of high position, who started to claim for themselves new rights, new freedoms, especially as Rome spread its influence all across the known world, they saw that a lot of foreign women had more rights and freedoms than they did. And so they wanted to be able to live more like them. And so in response to that, you could go and study up on this sort of thing if you want. The Roman Emperor Augustus passed a number of, he's the first emperor, the man who was emperor when Jesus was born. He passed some legislation that was basically unprecedented on marriage, on remarriage, on divorce. He was trying to legislate things according to traditional Roman morality against some of these new liberated women. The presence of an unveiled woman in public with a man signaled that she might not be his wife. Now, even a married woman typically didn't wear a veil in the home. If she was visiting the home of good friends, she would not wear a veil anymore once she had entered. She'd wear it on the street, but once she was in there, she'd take it off because they knew her well and they knew who she was. That could be part of the issue here in these gatherings in private homes, because they're meeting in homes and they're accustomed to removing the veil here. But the crux of the problem here is not every wife going without a veil any more than it is every man necessarily covering his head when he prays or prophesies. It's rather that some wanted to remove that veil that they were wearing, that covering, when they prayed, when they prophesied. And Paul makes this comparison that for us it might not mean much, but it's pretty shocking in the ancient world, to a woman who is shorn. If wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head. This was the penalty, for example, for an adulteress. Shaved your head, you're treated as if you were a prostitute. So this marks you out in a certain way. And the whole idea here is, in effect, he says, the Christian wife who removes her veil when she's praying or prophesying, she's parading around like one of those new Roman women, trying to insist on her own freedom and her own rights the way that was so common in the first century. So, the upshot of all this, and I hope you see at this point how a lot of this fits into some of the same discussions we've been seeing already, not only about people concerned with their status, but people concerned with their rights, with their freedoms. It's another example of those same issues. The upshot is that men dishonored their head, Christ, by covering themselves. Why is that? Why is it wrong for a man? Think about what we've just said, laid out these historical circumstances. Why would it be wrong then for a man to pray or prophesy with his head covered? Who's he drawing attention to when he does that? Himself. Yeah, that's the point. Because this is what was done out in pagan society, and was marking yourself out as elite, as the one offering the sacrifice, the one praying. So, in other words, he's drawing attention to himself. He's making this about his honor, his status, when he should be honoring God. That's why this is fundamentally wrong. Women, on the other hand, were obligated to have this sign of authority on their head. Otherwise, they dishonored their husbands, who were their head. And he reinforces this with an argument from nature, which nature here is used in the sense of just what's considered to be natural according to custom. It reinforces culture here. For Romans, long hair on a man was a sign of effeminacy. I mean, you could look at you've all seen, well, you've seen movies about Romans, and the haircuts in those are actually pretty accurate. When it's short, like this, they've all got fades here, basically, and it's all really short, bangs down across the front. That's how they cut their hair. A woman with a shaved head, as we've already said, was publicly shamed. In other words, and this goes back to Glenda's point, this is the big underlying principle. The proper distinctions between the sexes need to be maintained. Some of the ways those are manifested might be cultural, but you need to be able to make some sort of distinction. That needs to be maintained, and that's the basis for his appeal to the created order we read about as well. Now, We also need to note this puzzling bit here in verse number 10 that a woman ought to wear a head covering, ought to be veiled because of the angels. What in the world do you suppose that means? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, exactly. How did the angels come about in this subject? Seems like a weird non sequitur, doesn't it? What's he talking about here? Anybody have a thought? You're right. That is over there. Uh, Although that still seems like a strange thing to. Um, does anyone? I do. I'll see if anyone else does. Does anyone have a footnote there or some other sort of note with angels offering a different possible translation? No. You need a new Bible. That word angel, angelos, it can also simply be translated as messenger. And in fact, my Bible actually says this, which is good to give us a little more information. Or messengers, that is, people sent to observe and report. That word angel can simply be translated as messenger. Sometimes it means that. And as I said, the ESV says in a footnote, those sent to observe and report. I think that's the best way to understand this, that we're not talking about angels here at all. We're talking about human messengers here in the church. Now, that could be outsiders. It could be non-Christians who've been sent in to spy them out. After all, Christians are suspect, right? They're viewed with suspicion in the ancient world, so if they come in and they see you're not adhering to these normal customs, that's going to be something that's going to cause even more suspicion. It could be messengers from other churches. We have people carrying letters back and forth, so this could be somebody comes in from another church, and he's going to talk about the practice of all the churches at the very end of this. Somebody comes in from another church and sees this. What in the world are they going to think? Either way, I think the point is these are human messengers, not angels, and whoever this is, non-Christian or Christian, they would see that they don't conform to the standard practices either of culture in general or of other churches. Hold on, Wayne. Brother Taylor had something. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm taking it literally too, just in terms of that word doesn't always mean angels. In fact, more often than not, it wouldn't. That would depend on the context, but who knows? I I like this better because there have been a lot of really off the wall explanations offered for this, and to me, translating this simply as messenger uh, makes more sense in context instead of this allusion to angels out of nowhere. What were you going to say, Wayne? Hmm. Yes, it is. Uh, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but I think they're applying it though in a much more restrictive way than Paul is here. Um, in fact, I want to get to that reasoning before we wrap it up. I will say this. He concludes with a statement about contentiousness in the church. If anyone's inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Uh, some evidently had a mind to be divisive, to be contentious about wearing or not wearing the veil. If men did it, they were deliberately drawing attention to themselves and to their status. It was a signal of prestige to other members and to outsiders who were present. If women didn't do it, they were like these new women. They were abandoning the sign of marriage. So men dishonored their head, Christ. Women dishonored their Christian husbands. But these issues are just symptomatic of what we've seen throughout this letter. Strife, party spirit, contentiousness, factions, lawsuits, the abuses we're going to see at the Lord's Supper starting next week. It's just another example of these sorts of petty politics at work in the church in Corinth. But I want to take a step back here and note what we can say about Paul's reasoning. And I think Wayne, as I've already mentioned, picked up on this right off the bat. You go back to verse number 3. The divine order of leadership here is God, Christ, man, woman. Lydia and Jerry both mentioned this also. They seized on this. This was said at creation. It's intended to promote mutuality. Like you all said, woman was created second to man. She was made from him. She was made for him. But, as Paul says, man now comes through woman. So, in other words, neither one of them is independent of the other. They're both necessary, and all things come from God. Paul bases his principles of distinction here for the sexes in attire and in appearance on these premises, going all the way back here to creation. But how those distinctions are expressed, that's a matter of cultural norms. So I want you to notice Paul's argument, his underlying principle about maintaining these distinctions, about honoring your head. Those principles are timeless. But the arguments about the head covering specifically, those are all cultural. In verses 4 and 5, it's honor or shame for the man if he covers his head while he prays or prophesies. Verses 5 and 6, it is shame to the woman if she uncovers hers. In verse number 10, it's what's accepted as a sign of authority. In verses 13 through 15, it's what is regarded by humans as natural. And again, in context, that means what's typical, cultural. In verse number 5, it's the practice, or verse 16, I should say, the fifth point. It's the practice of the churches of God. You notice all these are culturally relative conditions. They all have to do with honor or shame or disgrace, with what indicates authority, with the practice of others, with what's regarded as typical. Honor and shame don't matter too much in our current culture, but if you know anything about the ancient world at all, you know that those were huge considerations in the Mediterranean world. On the other hand, if something's not considered a matter of honor or shame, if it has no symbolic significance, if it's not regarded as unnatural, well then that specific expression doesn't have any force. So in other words, to go back to that example of hair, some of you guys who might have had your 1970s style hair with it growing here over the ears and all feathered up back here in the back, in the Roman world, they would have looked at you really funny. They would have regarded that as effeminate. But in 1970s America, that was just cool, man. That was the style. And that's kind of the point here. There are distinctions to be made. The underlying principle is timeless, but the specific expression has to do with what's culturally relative. And I'll point out here, the last thing I'll say, why this matters going forward, because we'll come back to this, and I'll probably say a little bit more about this contradiction, supposed contradiction, when we get to chapter 14 and we can see the whole picture better. These arguments here about honor and shame and such, these are different from the arguments he makes in chapter 14, because there the argument is based on the law and on the commandment of the Lord. The distinction, even here, between male and female, that's absolute. As Glenda said rightly earlier, they ought to maintain that men ought to look and act like men, and women ought to look and act like women. That's right. That rests on creation. That distinction is absolute. But how that distinction is expressed, that's cultural. I think hair is a great example. But when we get to chapter 14, you'll see how he makes his argument differently. And that's really the best way to see how these two things line up. But I'll say more about that when we get there. I don't want to overload us. Any questions or comments here? Yeah, Wayne. Yeah, that's probably not realistic at all. Yep, no, no. Jesus almost certainly didn't have that long flowing hair like that. Now John the Baptist did because he had a Nazarite vow, from birth, so he couldn't cut his hair. But Jesus, oh, there was this great thing in, was it Popular Mechanics? I think. Yeah, maybe it was National Geographic a few years ago where they tried to uncover the face of Jesus. And it was just a composite, based on what your typical Palestinian Jew would have looked like in the first century. But he's got really short, curly hair, just like you'd expect. And that's probably what it was like. Also, I think I've said this before, but the average Palestinian Jewish male in Jesus' day was only about 5'2", which, how short was Zacchaeus? That he couldn't see over the crowd of 5'2" people. Anyway, anybody? I'm getting carried far afield. Anybody else with a question or comment? All right. Thanks for your attention this morning. Yeah, but